When you think of the Democratic Party today, you think of Marxist concepts and you're thinking of the so-called critical theory that people employ to create social change. But you're really dealing with a very, very distinct American brand of socialism. Marx had not invented anything new, and these scientists working at elite universities developing the critical theory after the Second World War, this was also distinctly American. So even decades before Karl Marx even became popular and relevant, the American upper class had developed its own ideas about socialism, which in practice is nothing else than overtaxation and over-regulation. So the upper class owned the major industries, and the upper class controlled politics and controlled the government. So what to do with the average population? Allow them to make more and more money and have more children? Certainly not. Allow them to create bigger and bigger clan structures that would rival the upper class? Certainly not. As early as 1832, a man called Clinton Roosevelt, yes, from that Roosevelt clan, had this idea of implementing socialist concepts in order to maintain the Union, to prevent a looming civil war between the North and the South. And the South had created traditional clan structures, and these clan structures in the South, they didn't like the central government, and they were running the slaves, and those elites in the South, they ran sort of their own empire based on medieval concepts or even old-style Roman Empire concepts. And they wanted to continue this style forever and ever while the world was moving forward. And this moving forward had purely imperialistic reasons. This was not the attempt to be nicer, right? So you had sort of a great reset during the 1800s when empire realized how important science was. It wasn't about having more slaves anymore. It was about who has more scientists and who has more factories, who has more production. So what these clan structures in the South did was a problem. That's why the Civil War happened. It was a power struggle. And so after the Civil War, it was the Democratic Party who tried to find new voters down there, people who were sort of on the losing side of the Civil War. Now, it seems crazy for us today because we associate the South nowadays with Republicans, with conservatives. But back in the day, the Democratic Party had a lot of success in the South, dominated politics down there for almost 100 years. And it was Democratic newspapers who created this cliche of the cool cowboy dude. The reality of being a cowboy was miserable because of the low pay and the work hours and the risks and the injuries. But to gain voters, the Democrats tried to paint this reality as fantasy. The cool whiskey guzzling, cigarillo smoking guy who's popular with the ladies, and the cool cowboy doesn't like the central government. He's a free spirit and all that. This was to gain votes. And for a long time, the Democratic Party was openly pro-business and supportive of the big banks. So it was obvious that Democrats and Republicans formed a two-party cartel, that it was one establishment running things. The Great Reset happening in the 1800s meant that you sort of had to empower the average citizen. Send them to schools, send them into the factories, and send them to university. Yet at the same time, as an empire, you needed to maintain the basic structure, the basic quota of 10% upper class and 90% of average people. So you needed corruption, you needed to control the newspapers, and you needed secret structures to maintain those numbers. Families in the South had created their own clan structures, and they were running an old-style empire down there. And so this became a problem for the central government, and so the Civil War happened. And after the war, after 1865, you had the era of the carpetbaggers, people from the north coming to the south to buy assets cheap. The central government was tossing ideas around to prevent this sort of thing from happening again. How can you prevent clan structures from forming? How can you prevent average citizens becoming a problem and becoming a competition for the ruling class? So an American socialism was needed. Clinton Roosevelt, who was related to Presidents John Quincy Adams and Martin Van Buren, was a founding member of a group called the Loco Focos, or Equal Rights Party, a radical faction of the Democratic Party. Now, as I mentioned, the Democratic Party for a long time was pro-business and pro-banks, but you saw the shift happening slowly towards an American brand socialism. And this had nothing to do with Karl Marx, who came later in Germany. This had nothing to do with Vladimir Lenin, who came even later to the game. After the economic crisis of 1837, Roosevelt was pushing for socialism to keep things quiet. And much, much later, in the year 1867, the Capital was published by Karl Marx. This book that became sort of the foundation for many socialists worldwide. But Karl Marx never invented anything new. He never put forward any new ideas. In 1845, Roosevelt gave a speech in New York. This was an event organized by Robert Owen, who also toyed around with socialist ideas. As early as 1825, Owen was giving speeches in the United States House of Representatives. He was talking in front of Congress, and he was painting the vision of a utopian society called a New Harmony. So he claimed to have better ideas to regulate society. And he was listened to by three former United States presidents: John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison. The President James Monroe was listening to that guy, and the next president, John Quincy Adams, was listening to that guy. Clinton Roosevelt published a book called The Science of Government Founded on Natural Law, and it basically defines American socialism much earlier than the works of Karl Marx. Roosevelt argued that his socialist ideas would prevent a coming civil war. This was a great fear of him because he realized that forcing the South to give up slavery would lead to a great upheaval. So many people would have to work the fields. They would become these simple style workers. And so these workers may rise up and, cause more problems. And that's why, according to him, you needed an American socialism. The modern Democratic Party, as we know it today, was created in the late 1820s. This was founded with some leftovers of the old Democratic Republican Party. Yeah, that's what it was called. And so just as the conservative Whig Party and the later conservative Republican Party, the Democrats used corruption in a systematic manner. They controlled media. They controlled fake grassroots organizations. The Democrats claimed to represent the little guy, and the Republicans more and more claimed to or aligned themselves with big business. For a long time, the Democrats didn't even propose a new public education system. They didn't necessarily wanted everybody to be educated, and Democrats were also for a long time not sympathetic towards Native Americans, and Democrats for a long time were against ending slavery. After the Civil War, the Republicans were pretty dominant because Democrats had positioned themselves against the war and they were considered unpatriotic. But in the South, you had a lot of angry people, and then you had an economic crisis in 1873, and that's why the Democrats could gain more followers, more voters. Seems crazy for us today that Republicans were pretty weak in the South and Democrats ruled the South. And it was Democratic media that created this image of the cool Southern cowboy dude guzzling whiskey, smoking cigars, and being a free, independent spirit, not liking the central government. So this cliche was created by Democrats, not Republicans. So they called it the Solid South. And the Democratic president, Grover Cleveland, didn't even try to implement socialism fast and violently. So he just he just implemented things slowly. He was called one of the Bourbon Democrats. Pro-business, pro-banker, pro-railroad dynasties, very laissez-faire capitalism. Or, as you would call it today, very libertarian. See, that's how fake political system is, and how fake these ideologies are. Republicans dominated the early 20th century, and the Democrats shifted more and more towards the marketing of being the party of the small guy against the rich. Economic crash of 1929, a worldwide recession that was paving the way for Franklin D. Roosevelt's victory in 1932. Roosevelt's New Deal program was supposed to create jobs through taxpayer money and new debt. So it was a light and shadow program. So quite a few average folks were helped by these government programs, but of course the government's control increased a lot. It was about 30 years of success for the Democrats. And this is when the Democrats became more openly socialist. And then you had World War II. You had Stalin's Soviet-Russian imperialism. You had the Korean War. And then China fell to the communists. And that made radical socialism unpopular in America. General Dwight Eisenhower became president for the Republicans. And then John F. Kennedy seemed like a fresh start in 1960. But that was just marketing. His administration was fairly common. It was staffed with establishment people. John F. Kennedy was, in general, a fan of secret black operations, as long as they worked. When these things exploded, of course, he became angry. And so when John F. Kennedy was killed, he was immediately turned into a saint-like figure, a martyr. And you saw these narratives that the evil right-wing establishment wanted to kill him. And that's sort of the narrative that survived to this day. It's a very normal administration. He escalated activities in Vietnam, was a fan of black operations. And the conspiracy buffs adopted that left-wing narrative, and they took it even further. So according to conspiracy literature, not only was John F. Kennedy an enemy of the intelligence agencies and the establishment in general, but he supposedly wanted to destroy the central banking system, or to strongly reform the central banking system. He supposedly pissed off the bankers, and that's why they got him killed. But for that extended narrative, lots of trickery was employed, and false quotes and quoting out of context. So Kennedy was not a threat to the establishment. Absolutely not. The assassination of Kennedy may have been something personal, because the Kennedy clan was heavily involved in mafia activities, especially John F. Kennedy's father. They made a lot of enemies. Maybe it was something personal. And after the assassination, he saw millions and millions of pages of documents related to investigation, more than any human could read. So to this day, we still don't know the whole truth. And so the government had the incentive to cover up certain things about the assassination, why it was done, but this was only to protect the system itself. President Lyndon B. Johnson, a Democrat, was a hardliner who could have been a Republican as well. So the Democrats had purged themselves of the hardline communists. But of course, you still had certain ideological connections, certain sympathies with the Soviet Union and China. The Republicans hunted communists and communist sympathizers in public, the McCarthy era. But behind everybody's back, the Republicans greenlit important technology sales to the Soviet Union. This was something that was done under Republican and Democratic administrations. President Reagan became a Republican. He was the synonym of the pinnacle of anti-communism. President George H.W. Bush sort of ended the Cold War era, and he was followed by Bill Clinton. Now, Bill Clinton was sort of friends with the Bush clan. Clinton had received a Rhodes Scholarship, basically from the British Empire, studied in Oxford, and then got another degree at the Yale University, where the Bushes had studied and became members of the secret organization Skull and Bones. Skull and Bones became very important, the Republican Party. George W. Bush was running for president, and his opponent was Al Gore. Al Gore had studied at Harvard. He was serving in Vietnam, and later he got a scholarship of the Rockefeller Foundation. So he then got another degree at a university that was named after the robber baron Cornelius Vanderbilt. So this is not what leftist people would assume, right? This was not how it was supposed to be. The Democrats were supposed to stand up for the little guy, not be in the pocket of the big guys, the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers and so on. So Al Gore became vice president under Clinton. And the Republicans had purged legit voters from voter lists, and that's how George W. Bush became president, and the Democrats didn't even make that big of a fuss. 2004, Bush wins again with the same tricks against John Kerry, and John Kerry was also a member of the Skull and Bones group, same as George W. Bush. So this is kind of how rigged the whole system is. And again, the Democratic Party did not make a big fuzz about that election manipulation. So these kind of techniques are even employed today. These techniques got Donald Trump into office, purging voters from voter lists. You may check out the research done by Greg Palast on that topic. So in reality, when it comes to the will of voters, in reality, you would have seen a lot of Democratic administrations. So you would have seen President Al Gore, or a president. Then you would have seen a President John Kerry, and then you would have seen a President Obama, and then you probably would have seen a President Hillary Clinton. Yeah, it sounds scary, but this is what the voters actually decided. But if you had one Democratic administration after the other, this would have been a problem for this system, for this two-party cartel. It needs to go back and forth every 4 to 8 years. And so, after the Obama era, you saw the era of President Trump. Now, Barack Obama and his family, they were all kind of tied to these, structures and networks. It was the U.S. Agency for International Development, Ford Foundation, the State Department, and all that. So it pretty much smells like the CIA, and you can delve into that topic if you want to. Now, Hillary Clinton, or Hillary Rodham, she started out as a young Republican. She was a fan of Nelson Rockefeller's pragmatic conservatism. So not too much Jesus, not too much, not too much Bible, right? Modern conservatism. She worked on Nelson's campaign, but then she switched over to the Democratic Party because as a woman, she had better chances there. She got accepted at the Ivy League university Yale, but she had to work in a factory in Alaska during the summers. She had to wash dishes to make money, which is probably why she became so greedy later on. And the Vietnam War gave people the opportunity to present themselves and market themselves as rebellious and sticking up for the little guy. So this is when Hillary Clinton moved to the left for strategic reasons. Bill Clinton was also studying in Yale, and he also had to do crappy jobs. And then they progressed within the Democratic Party, and there's been these accusations that Bill Clinton was attached to the CIA from a very early time. And you saw the investigative author Ambrose Evans Pritchard and many others writing books about that. Hillary worked as a lawyer for the Rose Law firm, and she was working for gigantic corporations such as Tyson Foods and Walmart. She followed Bill Clinton to Arkansas, and at some point, Bill Clinton visited a Bilderberg conference, and then he became president. Many scandals with the Clintons. Many people dying in their vicinity. Not everything you see on the web about the so-called Clinton murders is real. Not everything is sourced properly, but it's very suspicious. And then you had Joe Biden, whose career is basically owned by the DuPont family. American establishment. And the DuPonts, for a long time, married among their own family, among a very tight-knit circle. And they made their money with gunpowder sold to the United States government. And they made money with chemicals, Kevlar, explosives, and even plutonium. Joe Biden's father had moved the family to Wilmington, Delaware. And Delaware was controlled by the DuPonts. Joe Biden became a Delaware senator. And Delaware is kind of a tax haven. A lot of attributes remind us of offshore places, but it's classic onshore United States territory. Many corporations are registered in Delaware, where you can hide ownership, where you can hide certain structures behind front corporations, lawyers, and that sort of thing. So when he ran for senator in Delaware, Joe Biden praised DuPont. One of the best lawyers of DuPont became his advisor, or you may call him his handler. A chemist from DuPont became an important advisor. Ted Kaufman from DuPont became Biden's chief of staff for the next 20 years. T. Coleman DuPont and Henry A. DuPont became U.S. senators, and a man called Pierre DuPont IV became governor of Delaware. There were some scandals, some pretty serious scandals. You can look those up. This is how fake the American political system is, the two-party cartel. No matter how many times you vote Democrat, no matter how much activism you do on the streets or online, nothing will ever change that way. You may get some things out of it, right? You may get a certain social program out of it, or the abortion topic. You may get some things out of it, but as you've seen, these things have strings attached to them, and they might get taken away at a later stage, and you have to fight to get them back. And this is what keeps people busy, and this is what protects the upper class. And if you are a conservative, you will not defeat socialism in America by voting Republican. This is not how it works. Socialism was not a new thing that was invented. It was not a foreign thing that took a hold in America. This was not something that was introduced from the outside. This was not something that came along because of some Illuminati conspiracy. Of course, it would have been a nice thing to fight one war of independence and then be free, and then have a nice society, but it's not as simple as that. The so-called Enlightenment movement, which was the foundation for this American revolutionary struggle, the Enlightenment movement was largely controlled by British intelligence. They needed this to perform this great reset during the late 1700s and then during the 1800s. Moving away from a traditional empire with farming serfs and an open aristocracy, moving towards a modern style system where true power is hidden. Even British Freemasonry was created for that specific purpose, to perform this transition. And many people don't know that in the very early British Freemasonry, the focus was on scientific endeavor. And British Masonry was a partner organization of the so-called Royal Society, the most dominant scientific organization in the world. Elites not only control specific structures, they also control the ideas that we adopt.